All right. All right, we're ready to go? All right, I'd like to begin by thanking MFA Director Ellen Mueller, Administrative Assistant Kylie Van Note, my mentor Blue Delaquani, thesis committee members Corinne Teed, Julie Van Grohl, instructors Michael Banning and Sarah Peterson, my MFA cohort, the Service Bureau, and my family and friends who encouraged, motivated, fed me, and listened to me, and have continued to keep me afloat for the last 2 years. My name is Molly Murakami. I'm a cartoonist and illustrator. I've used the last 2 years to create a body of work that revolves around my life, experiences, and thoughts. But even before my deep dive into what was largely autobiographical comic making, my work still circulated around themes of identity, authenticity, and family, which I consider all very influential to my autobiographical comic making process. And while present Molly has had her doubts about making comics about herself, clearly past Molly had no problem with autobiographical genre. This is a real drawing by baby me, and it was both extremely obnoxious and deeply appropriate to find. In my time at the MFA program, I've had the good fortune to be around a bunch of incredibly talented people who in turn recommend incredibly talented artists for me to read and learn from. While artists like Carter Monier and Kate Beaton create humorous and playful comics, they document their realities with losing loved ones just as poignantly. Sarah Winifred Searle and Abby Howard teamed up to write Unhealthy, a 2-part exploration of body image and self-acceptance. Mari Naomi has long chronicled her experiences as a mixed-race woman searching for self-contextualization in both America and Japan. But me, what is there to say about me? Who would want to read comics about a person making their way through a master's degree? Cartoonist Linda Berry says, everyone. A song could be happy or sad, Berry has said, and I thought a comic strip should be the same. Then people started liking the work, and I realized I could discuss anything in the comics. What Berry implies is that through honesty and vulnerability, an author has the ability to reach others through comics, simply by building connections for those who like their work. Through formal structure, visuals, and content, Autobio operates in a way that allows the author to navigate their own identity while both finding and fostering community with those that read them. The more I read, the more I wrote, and the more I thought that maybe this was where my own voice fit in. So let's start with loss. Loss is closely tied to memory, which I'll discuss further in a moment, but also to trauma. As Frederick Berncollert states, because memory is both fragmented and usually visual in nature, the fragmented visual nature of the comics medium as a series of individual panels linked by gutters suits the representation of traumatic experience well. Not only does Collert see the value in comics as a vehicle for relaying stories of trauma, he values these sorts of trauma comics as a method of working through one's feelings as well, a mindset I carried into Basket. Basket is a short comic I made in 2018. It was initially a story about my upcoming move from St. Paul to Minneapolis, but Basket became more of an introspective examination of my anxiety and compartmentalization. The narrative itself is autobiographical. It's my car, my belongings, and my places in the Twin Cities. However, it excluded me. A speaker is never pictured. Basket was about loss. In moving to Minneapolis, I was giving up much of the independence I'd cultivated for myself in my years post-grad. And in packing up my life, I was revisiting memories of people I'd lost over these years and was kept in that traumatic space as the basket lived in the trunk of my car. I wanted to translate these emotions into a story that would resonate with others who are carrying literal and figurative baggage. Basket added to an existing canon of autobiographical comics about mental health and stigma, where those who are affected could find familiarity and community, and it situated my own identity in the process. Now for truth. In her graphic novel, 100 Demons, Linda Berry asks herself, is it autobiography if parts of it are not true? Is it fiction if parts of it are? Andrew J. Kunke gives us another way to ask this question. What happens when autobiographical comics lie? Mountains is an escapist fantasy mini-comic. The story follows a character's journey to inner peace, which sees them leave their material life behind and escape to a deserted cabin far north and off the grid. The protagonist changes and grows over time, but continues to speak in the first person. So is the main character me? Is Mountains autobiographical? While I considered the story to be my own, I began to wonder how I could classify the narrative as autobiographical if it didn't follow my real-life experiences. Karin Kukkonen has discussed thick concepts, ideas like treachery, promise, and courage, and I thought perhaps authenticity fit this bill. By establishing this sort of in-comic authenticity inside an abstracted autobio piece, I let part of the narrative go and give it to the reader to interpret and understand as they will. Mountain's abstraction set me up to experiment with autobiography further in a recent comic called Wide-Tooth Comb. Memory plays a huge part in autobio comics. Even though I've been here and making autobio works for a year and a half, Wide-Tooth Comb is still one of the first comics wherein I'm an explicit character. For Wide-Tooth Comb, I had to draw upon a lot of uncomfortable and hurtful memories as I drew myself over and over. Dr. Elizabeth L. Rafai says that the act of drawing and redrawing one's own body through the course of creating a work provides the opportunity for the creator to engage explicitly with their own body image and with the sociocultural assumptions and values that render your bodies meaningful. This seems super appropriate for a comic about hair and the worth it's been given in my life. Wide-Tooth Comb reflects my ongoing relationship with hair and, more broadly, performance of identity in real life. The narrative doubles back on itself as old memories are dredged up and revisited. Thus, the cyclical and rough art of the comic reflects the fluid nature of the narrative. While Mountains utilized a fantastical script as an autobiographical abstraction, Wide-Tooth Comb uses line quality, color, and the relationship between panels and negative space as a way of abstracting the story. Gridless panels provide snapshot of memories, while close-ups keep the visual narrative intimate, and both work with the narration to keep the whole story somewhat obscure. So Wide-Tooth Comb forced me to engage with my own body as subject and object, and together with the formal structures mentioned earlier, created a narrative of worth, trauma, and memory. As a result, the comic gives me an outlet for exploring my identity while also asking the reader to consider their own cultural or personal identity to hair, and further to performative identity as a whole. And now for thesis. How can I tie all of these elements, loss, truth, memory, identity, and authenticity together? My grandpa died in 1975. Any stories I've heard about him, and I've heard many, have been filtered down. He was a beloved person, but what do I know about him for real? The first-person connections I have to him are growing fewer and fewer, and I'm interested in documenting what we know while there's still time. In his book about generational trauma, Mark Woolen writes, "The great teachers understand where we come from affects where we go, and what sits unresolved in our past influences our present. There's no way around it. The family story is our story. It resides within us." I'm interested in researching my grandpa and learning more about his life, examining my own constructed relationship to him, the identity I derive from this relationship, and how his life continues to reverberate through mine today. The comic's format alone asks both creator and reader to consider what they are seeing as well as what they aren't. Formal elements work together to weave narratives that demand creativity on behalf of creators, and on behalf of readers, the ability to meet these creators halfway. All of these elements combine to create intimate and precious reflections on life for the purpose of telling, or perhaps hearing from others, "You are not alone, this is me too." Thank you.
I thank you for the presentation. It was great.
Thanks.
I would like to know what strategies do you have, like to, while doing autobiography, what strategies do you have to look at yourself? Like, do you distance yourself from yourself? Do you design yourself as a character, or like, what are the strategies that are you doing? And also, like you talked about your thesis being about your granddad, and how does it work? Like you, and how do you arrange like your circle and the things that are outside, like others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To answer the first part, I think that we, and I feel like a lot of the comics people in the room probably agree, like anytime we appear in our own work, it's kind of a character. It's not quite us, but it's functioning like us, and that's an element that I have done a little bit of reading on through the research process. So yes, I do try and distance myself a little bit, and I feel like especially with the initial comics where I wasn't a character, or the characters who kind of stood in for me didn't look like me. That was more distancing myself from them. In my thesis work, your presentation kind of reminded me of kind of where I want to go, in that I'll also be functioning as a character, and how the events that happen or what I find out kind of impact me and still kind of appear in my life, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very nice. Sorry, I had some feelings going through. You talk a lot about autobiocomics being a way of creating connections with others and of being able to, be vulnerable and honest and to put yourself out there. My question would be, how do you respond as a creator, but also as a person who's sharing something about themselves, when people connect to what you've presented them in ways that you might not expect, in ways that you might disagree with, in ways that you might feel actually are harmful, in ways that you might not have accounted for when you first put it out there, right? Like, what do you, when you've put that part of yourself out there and people take that and maybe use it in ways that you're not prepared for, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that autobio has a lot of really good qualities, and that like it by making your stories about yourself or about your experiences, it's offering someone who's reading them who might be going through a similar thing to relate. If it's misconstrued or if it's taken a different way, I think I try and be, like, especially in the hair comic, like my, and I talked about this in like the artist statement for it, my relationship with my hair is completely different from other people's, from other people of other ethnicities, like from people of different genders and religions, and so I can speak for what I experience and hope that lands well, and hope that finds its audience and its home. I think that, kind of going off of Camilla's question, there just has to be a little bit of distance then between the author and then what appears on the page, and you have to be okay with criticism and disagreements, and yeah.
What do you want to say about yourself through telling your grandfather's story?
Who knows? I don't know. I think it's interesting. I've been reading about generational trauma, and that's not the only like thing I want to pull from my grandfather's story, because I don't want it to be all sad or all bad. But it's interesting to think that there's like a story, for everyone that happened before we were even born, and that is physically present in our bodies. And I'm interested to see what I find out.
Okay. I've read a lot about a lot of your comics this year, and I've noticed a lot of patterns. And I was wondering if you could talk about your formal strategies in regards to like open spaces and like image meditation or something.
Yeah, that's been something that I've been hearing feedback on this year, and maybe not something that I'm actively thinking about while I'm doing it. So it's interesting to me to see these kind of recurring images or choices pop up. Definitely this year I have been a little bit more interested with what abstracting like a typical comics page looks like, or what that does to the story, and letting like negative space and gutters and panels kind of do as much talking as the narration or the drawing elements. So it's something I'm thinking about, but it's also, I'm not 100% sure if I'm aware of like specific patterns that I'm trying to replicate. Yeah. All right. Thank you all.